Welcome to Global View. I'm Ralph Begleiter in Washington. With protest demonstrations filling the streets of Belgrade, the Serbian regime of Slobodan Milošević is under strong pressure to accept the results of recent elections that went against his party. Equally large crowds have filled the streets when the exiled member of Serbia's former monarchy, Prince Alexander of Yugoslavia, has visited Belgrade, apparently supporting him. The protest marches in Belgrade in recent weeks are reminiscent of the ones which brought down communist regimes such as the one in East Germany at the end of the Cold War. They are a rare, open reflection of the strong undercurrent of unhappiness with the regime of Slobodan Milošević, who continues to rule with the centralized iron hand of the old communist days. That undercurrent has also bubbled to the surface in recent years with enthusiasm for this man, Prince Alexander Karađorđević, one of the heirs to the old Yugoslav monarchy. The monarchy was abolished just after World War II, and Alexander's family was thrown out of Yugoslavia by a military coup. Alexander set foot on Yugoslavian soil for the first time in 1991. Prince Alexander is a millionaire businessman today, but still imagines that he could contribute to resolving the political tensions of his homeland. That prospect raises hackles in the former Yugoslav king's capital today, where President Slobodan Milošević holds power. How might a return to Belgrade by Prince Alexander contribute to the unrest taking place in Serbia right now? Is the old monarchy even relevant anymore to events in former Yugoslavia? In a moment, we'll meet Prince Alexander Karađorđević, heir to the Belgrade throne, when Global View continues. Welcome back to Global View. Joining me now is the Crown Prince of Yugoslavia, Alexander Karađorđević. Prince Alexander, who are you and why do you pretend to the throne of Yugoslavia?
My father was the last king of Yugoslavia, King Peter II. And in 1945, he was removed illegally by the Tito then. And in 1947, all my rights were abolished. I was only 2 years old. My nationality and everything that was connected with Yugoslavia, it was illegal. Both my father and myself believed in democracy and respect of human rights.
Now, you actually have never lived in Yugoslavia, have you?
No, I've never lived in Yugoslavia. I lived most of my life in Europe and the United States.
You were born in London, I gather, in a hotel room. How did that happen?
Well, my father had his government in London at the end of the war. There were many other governments in London. And my father met my mother in London, and it was decided that I should be born in Claridge's, and it was turned into Yugoslav territory by the Home Office. That's the Ministry of the Interior in England.
Just for a day?
Just for the moment.
Why was that done?
Well, the rules were that the heir to the throne had to be born in Yugoslav territory, so the British government accommodated it.
Okay. Have you ever spoken Slavic languages, or how many languages do you speak?
I speak about 5-6 languages. I've taken lessons in Serbo-Croatian. I've continued these lessons, and I'm getting along rather well, I would say.
But the point is that you believe, because of the heritage of your monarchy, you believe you should be able to return to Yugoslavia as its king.
I have every right to be there. That is my vocation. My vocation is to bring democracy, to bring understanding between peoples, and to stop this horror that's been going on.
Now, you went back to Yugoslavia. You went back to Belgrade, actually, twice in recent years, at least twice anyway that I'm aware of. What happened when you went? When did you go back, and what happened?
The first time was in 1991, in September, October 91, and I went there with my wife and 3 children. We were received by a tumultuous population. I would say half of Belgrade were out of the streets. It was very positive. And of course my message, as always, was for democracy and reform.
You know, you're not the only monarch, in effect, who has been, whose monarchy has been pulled out from under them, so to speak, in Europe, certainly. And I think there's certainly a feeling in Europe that when things are going badly somewhere, people say, well, let's bring back the monarchy. That ought to be a good solution. Is that what may be happening in Yugoslavia?
There's a possibility. You must not forget that at least half of the European Union are constitutional monarchies. And don't forget Japan is a constitutional monarchy. I think there's a great amount to be offered by a constitutional monarchy in Serbia and Montenegro. And this can grow in whichever way the politicians take it. But first you must have freedom of the media, democracy, and human rights.
How were you treated in Belgrade by the government at that time when you went back in 91, and I guess you went back again in 92?
They ignored me completely.
You had no meetings with the officials there?
The people were happy. The government wasn't.
But they still let you in?
Well, I wonder if they would now, because there's big demonstrations, as we know, demanding that the municipal elections be recognized and they abolish them. And maybe my appearance would create some problems and rally more people. But I think that they've been doing very well.
What effect do you think a return by Prince Alexander to Belgrade at this moment, when we've seen weeks of demonstrations in that city, might have on the fate of Yugoslavia?
I think it would have a tremendous effect on all the Balkans. First of all, I believe firmly in democracy and a better future for all the peoples who live in the former Yugoslavia. I think relations will improve dramatically, and there will be a domino effect from Belgrade in removing these people from the past. The people of the past are the legal communist people who mutated into other parties in the Croatias and Serbias, and only interested in power. They want to exercise their power, the people. They're incapable of compromise. So my being there would help the voice of democracy and also help the people to get on with each other.
Now, you're Serbian by background, right? In fact, I think one of your ancestors, Black George, I guess was his nickname, fought the Serb uprising against the Ottoman Empire.
That's absolutely correct.
What is your feeling about the Serbian nationalism, which we've seen a great deal of, not only in recent years, but even in recent days and weeks?
Well, we should all note there's been negative nationalism throughout the former Yugoslavia. And it's this negative nationalism and the misuse of religion that has contributed to the conflict. I'm very much against this type of nationalism. You can see the disaster that's happened. Just take a look at Bosnia-Herzegovina and the war in Croatia.
And you would, your return, you do not think would fuel that kind of Serbian nationalism?
No, because I've never supported any extremist group. I don't believe in extremism. I believe in the voice of democracy. Let the people choose, but the people have to see the choice. At the moment they're denied this by a state-controlled media. There's deceit, deception every day.
But the crowds that turned out for your return in 91, 92, you don't think that was fueled in a way by Serbian nationalism?
No, I think that there were the same crowds as today, identical. The crowds that are in the streets today are a very much educated lot. There's the students who are really quite fantastic. I visited in 92 all the faculties in Belgrade University. These students are pro-democracy, pro-Western. Don't be deceived by some elements that have been fired up by the regime to counteract the wounds.
What happens if you were to go back? Well, why don't you go back tomorrow, let's say?
Well, I doubt it very much if they'd let me in. Also, I think it might be premature. It may create even more problems. I'd hate to see any bloodshed, anything to provoke the government. Remember, we're dealing with some thugs there.
What do you have to wait for? You said premature. What would you wait for in Belgrade to provoke a return?
I think the signal would be for the opposition to enter into discussion with the regime and to be allowed into a kind of a transition government. But remember, we must leave this to the politicians. The only way forward is to bring those who believe in democracy and to retire those who have been the tyrants and the creators of the wars of the succession of the former Yugoslavia.
Do you think he would be invited back if the protesters, the pro-democracy protesters, were to somehow gain power in Belgrade?
I believe so. The need is very much for a person like myself who has had the contacts with the West, has friends in the West, all nationalities, all religions. My wife and I have much to contribute, and even our children. We contribute to sanity.
I don't want to be beating around the bush here. You don't want to return now because it's premature. Are you afraid that Slobodan Milosevic's government might attack you or in some way hurt you or your family?
Well, back in 92, there was an extraordinary situation. There was demonstrations similar to the ones today, and the students were out too in Protest 92. The regime, that is the leader Milošević, remained behind closed doors and ignored the whole process. I can see something similar today developing. This is why we need the West to project and assist the rise of democracy. is not dealing with internal matters. This is dealing with people's rights.
What should the West be doing that it isn't already doing? There are already sanctions against the Belgrade regime.
Well, sanctions will only help Mr. Milošević because he will say, look, they're against us, you need me, I will help you. What is required is to project those who believe in democracy across the democracies of the world, across all the screens, and assist them in communicating to the people on location. The state-controlled media is a real propaganda machine that attunes people and disinforms people and portrays them as anti-Serbian and anti-whole setup. So I think if the West insists on a free media, people like Katie Morton, the wife of Dick Holbrooke's been out there, she's tried very hard. I think now the United States government, the last superpower, the great democracy of the world, has a moral responsibility for the next 4 years under the Clinton administration to make the changes not only in the former Yugoslavia towards democracy, but in many other countries of the world. We can live better under democracy.
You have had a chance here in Washington to try to have a meeting at the White House, and I gather you did have a meeting with a White House aide. Why have we not seen statements of support for the return of a constitutional monarchy to Yugoslavia?
I believe there is a sort of foggy area about constitutional monarchy. They don't realize that the constitutional monarchies in Europe are highly developed democracies. There's what you might call the George III effect. But you have the case of King Juan Carlos of Spain, my cousin, who I think must be credited by bringing democracy to Spain. I think he is a role model. Of course, there are differences, but it was a very tough regime. It was a fascist regime, and today Spain is a great democracy and a member of the European Union. And the Spanish people love him very much, and he provides a good balance. What does he provide? Unity and continuity. The people elect the government. He isn't the president, or he isn't the absolute ruler, but he's there to make sure everybody meet.
Is that the role that you would envision for yourself?
I think it's very important. Of course, you have to be very tough in the beginning to get democracy going and to put people together. There are a lot of bad feelings. There are a lot of animosities. There's the years of communism, which have attuned people to a certain way of thinking. We have to move on from that. We cannot be always the outcast of Europe. This is why the United States cannot have the convenience of having enemies across the face of this earth. They must assist these people who are being badly ruled turn into democracies.
A lot of animosities you mentioned in the Balkans, not to mention the border disputes with Croatia, for example. How would you deal with those?
Well, they're tremendous disputes over territory. I believe that should you get democracy in Belgrade, it will have a toppling domino effect on Zagreb. Zagreb needs democracy also. They have a state-controlled media, and their state party, as you might call it, HDZ, the Democratic Party of Croatia, is similar to the Socialist Party of Belgrade. They profess the same thing, which is total power. They don't believe in compromise.
I realize at the moment we're talking pie in the sky here, but if you were to return to Belgrade, if that scenario were to play itself out, what would you do with Slobodan Milošević?
Well, I think he should go into retirement. I think this is a matter to discuss with the politicians who will be elected eventually. They must decide. The judicial system needs reforming. I mean, the judicial system is totally ludicrous at the moment. That all needs to be examined in time.
Should he go to the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague?
Well, all those who committed crimes against humanity must pay for their crimes in a competent court, be it The Hague. Let the court decide. But I wish to remind everybody there are very few angels in the former Yugoslavia.
You are sort of a representative of something in the post-Cold War era, a phenomenon that really hasn't happened. And that, by that I mean, we haven't seen, in the absence of the communist regimes of former Cold War days, a kind of uprising of the people saying, we want our kings and queens back. That just hasn't happened. Why not?
Well, I think there has been huge demonstrations. In my case, in '92, there were colossal crowds throughout Serbia when I drove around Serbia. And I don't think the regime enjoyed this at all. You must remember that I'm not allowed the luxury of access like we are having at the moment on television. I'm censored, and so are the politicians who believe in democracy. They're censored by the state propaganda machine. The only thing that goes through is B92, that must be commended, that radio station in Belgrade, that doesn't go too far in Belgrade either. And also Naša Borba, which is a very reputable liberal newspaper, they must be commended, but they only reach a few people.
Now, Slobodan Milošević is reported to actually favor the return of a monarchy in Serbia, but I gather that he favors the return of Prince Tomasov.
It's news to me. I think there's games that are being played. There's games that are being played to undermine the rightful heir, being myself, by using members of my family and promising certain things. It's a sad case. I think it's come to its end. Eventually, all these games will fizzle out, and with the help of the United States and the European Union and a push towards democracy, any type of game like that should go away.
All right, let's just talk for a moment about a scenario. In coming weeks, days and weeks, if the demonstrations continue and Milosevic's regime weakens, what would you envision happening? And then give me the opposite side. What happens if Milošević regains his power, puts down the demonstrations? What do you think is going to happen in your country?
Well, in the case of President Milošević gaining the upper hand, I can see games taking place, and that is by firing up one of the spots, trouble spots that we have. And we have no shortage of trouble spots. As you know, we have the Bosnia situation, the Sanjak situation, the Kosovo situation, the Vojvodina situation. We have also the southern flank situation. And he can fire one of these areas up and blame, of course, the opposition, those who are in the street who are educated people, for having created this problem and fire up a new round of nationalism. The good side would be if he realizes that he is a spent force. He's a dinosaur of the past. The whole of Europe are democracies, except for Serbia, and also, for that matter, Croatia. And he has to give up. But we need the assistance of the European Union and the United States to retire him.
What should the European Union and the United States do in the coming weeks that would break the bubble in Yugoslavia?
Put pressure on him and realize that he has no control over Republika Srpska, that is the Serbian republic within Bosnia. President Biljana Plavšić has not accepted one single phone call from him. I think there's some hope here. If rewards are given to the opposition and rewards are given to Mrs. Plavšić for deeds that are done, for putting human rights first, and I think they're perfectly capable of doing this, and ignore the sidetracking of nationalists that are being fired up by being paid hard currency. One has to be careful. These are great game players from the Cold War.
You had a chance when you were back in Belgrade to visit the White Palace, or at least see it from the outside. Do you imagine yourself living there again one day?
Well, it would be actually the old palace, Stari Dvor. Who knows? Maybe one day. It may be the symbol of a new democracy and an open house for all those that believe in helping people. Give it a try.
Prince Alexander Karađorđević, thank you very much for joining us
on
Global View. I'll be back in a moment with a page from my reporter's notebook when Global View continues. Here's a page from my reporter's notebook. One of the best parts of my job here at CNN has been the opportunity over the years to interview virtually every level of official, including royalty. And while Americans seem to adore royalty, there is always some hesitation among U.S. journalists about using honorific titles of kings and queens. Somehow living in a society without royals, I just feel uncomfortable referring to a king or queen as Your Highness. Likewise, there is always a moment of hesitation about greeting a royal. There was a flap here in the U.S. a few years ago when an American official, obviously not a subject, bowed or curtsied to the Queen of England. But most royals I've met have taken the pressure off, usually by offering a handshake. And in my experience, it's more often been the dictators, not royalty, who seem to demand more in the way of fawning by journalists they meet. Well, thanks very much for joining me on CNN's Global View. If you'd like to comment on something you hear on this program, we'd like to hear from you. Send us a letter, a fax, or a computer message. We'll leave the addresses on the screen for you. Please be sure to tell us where you're watching us. A viewer in Croatia may have misinterpreted a comment I made in a recent reporter's notebook. I described how the Croatian embassy in Washington had told me Croatian President Tudjman was not in a local hospital when in fact he was. Our viewer wrote to complain that I had said Croatians were liars. What I actually said is, either Tudjman had deliberately kept his most senior diplomatic staff uninformed, or the Croatians were lying. My experience with many nations over the years told me neither alternative was out of the question, and that applies, as I said, to many nations. That's it for now on Global View. I'm Ralph Begleiter in Washington. We'll see you next week.